Hi, I'm Paul Smith, and welcome to Chicago Crystal.
So, hi, Paul Smith, and welcome to Chicago Crystal. We're really happy to have you, and I've been following you for a while and your work in Lucky. And I just wanted to ask you, how did you get into programming and kind of find your way around the software community?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to chat. I got started sometime in high school. Really, what happened was I was interested in design. So I learned Photoshop, tried to learn HTML and CSS, and eventually I wanted to sell some stuff online. And back at that time, it was about 12 years ago, Shopify wasn't really a thing, or if it was very early on and I didn't even know about it. And really, the only options you had were these pretty ugly websites. And I didn't really like that. So I thought, well, I kind of want to make my own thing. So I tried a few things. I tried Cold Fusion, which is not a thing anymore.
No, it is not.
I was incredibly confused by everything, and just gave up and thought, I'm never going to program anything. This is not fun at all. Eventually, I found Rails somehow. I don't even know what it was exactly, but I saw the 15-minute build a blog demo that DHH did. And I was like, I can do that. Like, I can type a scaffold command. And so that's really where it started, was seeing some of their demos and screencasts and just going, oh, I could do that. And I want to do that. There were a lot of cool things. So I bought a Ruby on Rails book, which helpfully, this was like Agile Web Development on Rails version 1 or something like that. And the sample app was actually building a shopping cart system and building a checkout. You remember it?
Yeah, I remember that book. I used that book as well, but I'd used it after Rails had advanced a little bit, and it still had remote JavaScript, at least in the version that I had. And I tried to do a PR with that at work, and someone was like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, I didn't know any better. I was like, cool, JavaScript stuff, but I write Ruby. That sounds nice. With RJS and, their inline JavaScript helpers and stuff. It was fun, though. I mean, at the time, it was just cool. Maybe it wasn't the best practice to be doing all those things. But for a new person, being able to type, this was like way back, but you could just say like visual effect, slide down when you click some button. Not super scalable, but when you're new, being able to type that and have like these really cool websites that at the time, like people weren't doing animations, people were barely doing Ajax, and being able to do that was mind-boggling. So that's really where it got started, was with Ruby on Rails. And I'm still a huge fan of Ruby and Rails.
Yeah, I mean, I use Ruby and Rails every day, and I am consistently surprised at how efficient and how much you can get done in one sitting. Yeah, I never saw the DHH blog until way later, like after starting Rails. But going back, it was less polished than I thought it would be. There's a lot of yeah. I mean, it just shows the effectiveness of the idea. I think his delivery was what was needed to get it started, but it was a little rough. But it's such a great project.
Yeah, it was. I remember it being a little rough, but also kind of mind blowing. Like the scaffolding thing, like we kind of take that for granted now. Generators and scaffolds, but that was pretty new. Being able to just say, "Hey, scaffold a blog post," and then boom, you have like a full CRUD UI. It's pretty incredible. And also, even though it was like a little, maybe not the perfect presentation, DHH is just a salesman. Like
he is.
he can pitch stuff so well. And I mean, that's part of what makes Rails so successful, is just the way he frames things, the way he writes. It's very clear. He can be, a little much sometimes, but nonetheless, he's really, really good at the marketing sales type stuff.
He is who he is with little filter, and I appreciate that just from being who you are standpoint. But he definitely is a firebrand for some people.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've taken some inspiration from his framework and from his delivery, and probably trying to sell Lucky a little bit.
Yeah, definitely from the framework. I haven't done a ton in terms of selling and marketing Lucky. I think that's been good. And I mean, we can dive into that. But yeah, definitely stuff from his framework, from Phoenix, from Haskell, Elm. There's a lot of different inspirations, as well as Laravel, which is a fantastic PHP framework. But in terms of sales and marketing, we haven't really been pushing Lucky too hard. We tweet about it, have the blog posts, post to Reddit and things like that, but haven't done any screencasts or big demos.
Maybe we should back up and tell people what Lucky is and kind of the environment that it lives in. So like Lucky is made in Crystal, and how did you kind of find Crystal among the languages and the community, and how did you come to the idea of making Lucky?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I always love experimenting with new stuff. At the time, Rails was new, so I don't mind using things that aren't totally finished. I played around. I tried to like JavaScript and the ecosystem. It's not my particular cup of tea. I really wanted to like Ember and React and Express and stuff. I didn't like it for a few reasons, so I kind of looked for something else. And this whole time, I'm still using and loving Ruby. I tried Elixir and the Phoenix framework. I was really into that for a while, contributed a few libraries that are in use today. One of them is Bamboo, which is an email library, and Ex Machina, which is a testing library. But that still didn't quite fulfill the need. What I was looking for was one, performance. Yes, I think Rails is productive, and I'd rather be productive than have a super fast language where I have to spend 5 times as much time building my thing. But hey, if I can do both, if I can get a fun language and have it be way faster, that sounds great. Elixir kind of fit that for me. Functional versus object oriented wasn't a huge selling point for me. Ruby has functional paradigms in it, and I think it's great to be able to use both.
I agree with you. I think the both is like the biggest sales pitch, and going entirely functional, I haven't enjoyed as much as having OO languages that have a functional flair.
Yeah, I feel the same. To some degree, it's personal preference, but I like having an object and saying, this is what my object needs, and then just being able to call methods. I like that with objects, especially if they're, I'll say well-designed, but that's up for debate what that means. You're not passing arguments around all the time. And when you are, it's because you need them. And so to me, it helps me focus. It helps me focus on what's important to that method. Whereas with functional programming, you're passing everything. And it can get a little...
I never thought about it that way. I like that type of perspective. I think that it's somewhat of the way that I think about programming. You set a lot of things up and then you act on those things. I think passing things through works in certain contexts, works with certain collections of stuff, collections of data. But when you're trying to set up a socket or trying to do some other things, it is really handy to have kind of something that is in a certain state, or something that you want to cause a state change on. I'd be interested how Elixir, like what the Elixir standard library socket looks like. I have not taken a look at it.
It's interesting. So I took a lot of inspiration from Elixir and Phoenix, mainly in the sense that things are composable. So I don't always love that word because it's like, what does that even mean? But for me, at least, it means that things are flexible. They're not so concrete that using something a little differently than it was intended is just like this impossible, insurmountable task. Part of the reason it works so well in functional languages and Elixir is that you are passing things. So if you had a WebSocket, you actually have, they call it a map or a struct, which is just data. It's only data, no methods. And you kind of just pass that around to all the functions.
Okay.
And it's quite flexible because you can use any method you want. You just pass the socket. You can create a module, and as long as you pass the socket, you can do whatever you want. So I don't know if that helps. But
I think I'd have to take a look at it, but that makes a lot of sense. I can at least visualize it. Mm-hmm. I think composability is a kind of abstract concept in some ways, but I will say that when I moved from PHP and Java and into Ruby, the active record library was the most composable way to set up a query, and it was just a breath of fresh air. It completely changed the game to do .where, just be able to chain all that stuff together. It was like night and day from comparison to the Java library that I moved from and the PHP that I started with.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Active record was huge. I mean, saving and working with data is probably one of the most complicated parts of building a web app. Well, it was. I think once you throw in a single page app and APIs and things like that, there are other things, but definitely working with data is up there.
So it sounds like you had a pretty good kind of background to kick off your own web framework. You have some front end with JavaScript and some of the other explorations you've had. You had Ruby and some Elixir kind of going on to see the differences in languages and kind of know what you want, didn't want, some performance, some, I guess I would call efficiencies, at least in the for the programmer. And at some point you kind of stumbled across Crystal and decided to kind of start your own. Why start a web framework? It seems like, not many people want to take that level of pain.
Yeah. I mean, I was definitely told that too. Like, why don't you just start with the ORM? Why don't you just start with, but I'll go back a little bit, in terms of why Crystal. Honestly, originally I'd first seen Crystal probably a year or two before I used it and was totally turned off. I didn't even investigate it because I'm like, okay, so this is just Ruby, but fast. I think that isn't the whole picture, but it's really easy to look at it that way because it looks so similar. And so I'm like, hey, if I'm going to learn a new language, I want to learn a new language, not Ruby again, but compiled. So I kind of let it go. But I got more and more interested in using types and compilers to catch bugs. So we had a bunch of people really interested in Haskell at Thoughtbot in Boston. I tried to get into it. It's bonkers to get started or build anything in it. But I liked the idea of kind of stopping yourself from getting into trouble by using types. Elm was like a little better version of that, but I like that idea, and that's actually why I strayed away from Elixir, was because I was still getting, even with the functional programming and some new paradigms that Phoenix introduced, I was still getting a ton of bugs. You still get nil errors where you call a method on something that's nil and you just didn't realize it. Or, you add an argument to a method and you think you got everything, but you actually, you missed a call site, right? So then Crystal kind of just became more appealing. I'm like, actually, this might be pretty awesome. It's fast. It looks good. It catches nil errors and has macros, so you're not writing tons of boilerplate. That's kind of why I got into Crystal. In terms of why Lucky, really the main reason is that type safety. This is really hard to explain, so I'll attempt to, but what it comes down to is I wanted really strong compile time guarantees that caught a lot of potential bugs that web developers run into all the time. And none of the other web frameworks or even ORMs were approaching things in that light. And I think because it's hard to see really what that looks like until you have it like in front of your eyes. So I've had people say like, I didn't get lucky. And that sounds funny. They didn't get lucky until they tried it, basically. And we're like, wow.
I didn't get lucky until I tried it. I had tried every web framework in Crystal, including Lucky. And I had two barriers I had to cross. One was, what are all of these concepts? Why do I have to make an operation? I have a model.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding of a model and what an operation was just didn't match when I first stepped into Lucky. And the second thing was the DSL for the HTML threw me off, and I did not like it. I wanted to use Lucky after a little while, and after I learned about operations, and remove the DSL. And then I grew to love the DSL.
Mm-hmm.
I got converted somehow.
It's funny because, like, I mean, a lot of the ideas that eventually happened in Lucky, I did not want to do. And it just happened to become what it became. So, for example, and just to kind of clarify to people what operations are in Lucky, typically in Rails, or honestly a lot of frameworks, you have a model which is in charge of like a bunch of things, querying the database. It represents a database record, and it has validations, and it lets you write to the database. In Lucky, the model is just a representation of a database record, and that's it. You save records using an operation. So this is just a class where you give it some params or arguments. You can write validations in that operation. You have callbacks in that operation. And that's what lets you save stuff to the database. That came out of partly... Oh, sorry. Did you have a question?
No. I was just agreeing with you that is... that's a really good thing to cover. And also that was my understanding of them.
Okay, perfect. So then it's like, well, why? That actually was one where I kind of had that in mind from the beginning. That came from Ecto, which is Elixir's, it's not an ORM because they don't have objects, but that's probably the best way to think about it.
Maybe an FRM.
They have change sets. Yeah, exactly. They have what's called change sets, which are kind of like operations in Lucky, where you start with a change set and say, okay, like here's a validation, and this is where functional comes through. You basically, a change set is like data, like a hash, you could think of it. And you pass it through functions that are like, okay, this change set has a set of params. I want to validate that the name param is there. And if it's not, I want to add an error to the errors key. And so you slowly transform the change set as you go. The reason that's really powerful is you can kind of start with a base change set that says, like, here's my default validations. But then you can kind of extend it and say, okay, here's my one for registration. And that sets a password and validates a password. You might have one for just updating the password, where you only want password and confirmation of the password. So it kind of lets you compose different functions to build them out. And that's a huge deal because in Rails, everything's kind of in one model, but you often have lots of different ways of saving that model. For example, with users, right? Like sometimes you want to register a user, in which case you want to encrypt a password, you want to require a password. In other cases, maybe you just want to update the name. And when you do create a user, you might want to send a welcome email. But in other cases, you don't want to do that. Operations let you kind of do that.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, now that you're mentioning it, I want to try a few things that I've always thought were a little difficult in Rails. I know there are multiple frameworks to do this, and I think even Devise has it now. But doing invitations always seemed to be a pain to me. And I'm kind of curious if Lucky has a good way to create a user and then invite them to the platform. I mean, not necessarily built in, but if you could use operations to make that a little bit more seamless and a little bit easier from the developer standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. That is one of the types of things where an operation works perfectly. Actually, I wrote a gist up because someone was trying to do that. And we had different operations for an invitation. So we had a send invitation operation, where that can create like an invitation record with a token and send an email in an after commit hook. So this is all super testable because it's just a single class. You instantiate it, call it, test that it did stuff. And then we had an accept invitation, which finds an invitation based on the token and then creates a new user and registers them. So it's definitely possible. And those are exactly the kinds of things that operations are great for.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. There's also something that has happened at least once in positions that I've been in, but it has kind of been a problem consistently, which is that testing invitations for some reason has always been a little flaky in the positions I've been in. And we have had the invitation flow broken a few times and not realized it, and caused a pretty big kind of problem for the business.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lucky in general has pretty good built-in testing for web browser flows.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there would be a good way to test invitations in Lucky and kind of stop problems like that? Honestly, I think some of the type safety might have stopped the problems that we had previously. But is there any type of good email flow testing?
Yeah, there is. So I built the email library called Carbon. That's also tries to make things as compile safe as possible, meaning you have to give it a from. You have to give it some kind of HTML or text body and a bunch of other things that mean it's going to be a valid email, or at least very likely to be one. And because of those compile time guarantees, it also means that if you don't send it the information it needs, it will not compile. If something in the view needs something and you changed the data somehow, it's going to not compile. So that helps a lot. But we also have test helpers that test the delivery of emails. So let's say you had an invitation email, and that would be the class, because everything in Lucky, we like objects. So you would have an invitation email class, and it does invitation emails. That's it. You would basically instantiate that in the test with maybe your invitation record, which has a token on it. And you would say, expect to be delivered. You say invitation email.new with your invitation. And it's going to just check that at some point during your flow, it delivered that. So you would do that using Lucky Flow, which you kind of hinted at. That's kind of like the capybara of Lucky, which if you've used Ruby, you've used that, or Cypress in the JavaScript world. But we make it very easy to test the emails were sent out and make sure that they have the content you expect.
That's pretty awesome. We've kind of jumped into some of the details here, but one thing that I really wanted to kind of ask you about in the creation of this framework is the kind of two main things that I saw in your initial pull request and that are still on the main site now, which is performance and debugging, and or fewer bugs. And I think we kind of discovered how you came about that just from your history and kind of your previous program experiences and walking kind of into, Crystal and wanting to build a framework. We've talked a fair amount about type safety and about how it is intended to kind of stop bugs in Lucky. But can you explain kind of in the design of Lucky how you're trying to use Crystal's type system to stop bugs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a good question because it's one of the hardest things to explain. And in fact, we were talking about marketing and selling. Honestly, fewer bugs isn't necessarily a huge thing people believe or care about when they want to learn something new. It's definitely a core part of Lucky, but we need to emphasize some other stuff. And we can get into that. But yeah. So for example, actions. So actions are basically like controllers, but they only handle one route. And that means that there is one class per route. Honestly, I did not want to do this at first. I wanted to do something more in line with Rails, where you have a controller and it might have an index and a show and an edit and an update. But what it came down to was that's simply not possible to do in a type safe way. Most other frameworks are doing that, I think partly because it's just like what you're used to, right? if you're used to Rails, that's kind of how you're going to design things, especially when the language looks so similar.
Yeah.
I'll give you some scenarios of why that doesn't work for the types of things that I wanted. So I wanted compile time guarantees around parameters. So if a path said it had an ID, and I basically want to be in my action and know that I will have an ID inside of that action. It won't be nil. I won't have a typo. I'll know for a fact that it's there. The other part of that is when I generate a link. So in Rails, you've got like, if you have blog posts, you would have blog post path, and you would have blog post path for a show where you pass it an ID. You can forget parameters there. And it's not always clear that you did it. So I wanted it to be very clear that if I added a parameter or a required query parameter to an action or a path, that at compile time it blew up if I forgot that anywhere.
That makes sense. I think
another
Athena
huge
handle. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say that totally makes sense, and I think there's a few really good insights there. I think it's interesting how you chose to handle it, because in Lucky, you decided to break things out by class. And I think Athena, when I wrote a sample app in that, did something similar, but they did it via annotations. So it sounds like you're really leaning on the side, or like on the kind of type system, while I guess Athena is also leaning on the type system, but it's much more leaning on annotations per method. I kind of like the implicitness of Lucky.
Yeah, it is a bit more, it's clear. I personally don't like annotations. I try to avoid them at all costs, mostly because I think they just look weird and I like things to look nice. But also because they're just not that flexible. Method, like you can pass things to methods. Annotations, they're compile time only. But we can get into why actually that isn't quite as type safe. But just one of the last things that I really wanted with actions was I wanted to have compile time guarantees about the HTTP method. This is such a time saver. If you've used Rails or Phoenix, or honestly, almost any other framework, I've never seen a framework that does this, where let's say you want a link to delete a user. So you make the link, you give it the path, like users/1. You click on it, and you get a route not found or some other weird error that doesn't make sense. It's because you forgot to put HTTP method delete.
Yep.
Or another one is forms, right? Like let's say you have an update form, and you're wondering why the heck it's not updating. Why is it not working? Because you forgot to change it to method put instead of put.
Or one thing that you guys have solved in Lucky that I really appreciate is the way that you generate URLs, because in Rails, there's a few different ways to make URLs. But if you're using URLs inside a template, there is a chance that if you change a route or a name, you have changed basically the URL generation, the path helpers. And unless you know all the copy finder places, or you can narrow down a search to only show you the URL generators and the templates, you might be missing things. It's always a little bit of, you feel like you got 90% of the way there and you can't find anything else. So you kind of assume that if the tests pass and all of your greps and finds and searches work, then you probably fixed all the path generation. But in Lucky, I have noticed with the path, at least the way that I've used it, that the confidence level I have is I think that's the one thing about Lucky as well. The confidence level I have in changes and predictability is so much higher. When I change something in Lucky, I'm very confident that the change that I made is what's happening in production. And in Rails, there can be that question in the back of your mind because of all the different magic it does.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you put that really well. That's what it's about. Fewer bugs, but the confidence you get from fewer bugs. Because there are certain classes of bugs in Lucky that are, I don't want to say impossible, but we'll say extremely close to impossible. I'm sure there's ways that you can, there's always ways. It's programming, it's computers. There's ways to break stuff. But basically, if you use the route helper, it's there and it will work. And the params are right, and your HTTP method is also right. And if you change it, it will tell you everywhere where you forgot it. And so that's just one set of things where it's like, you don't have to worry.
It's very true. My worry level is very low with things I've deployed in Lucky.
That's good to hear, because that's definitely the goal. But so Lucky's always kind of started as like it needs to be pleasant and understandable, but meet those compile time safety goals. So the reason we went with actions as a single class, because that wasn't how it was when I was prototyping, is because it is the only way to guarantee compile time guarantees for parameters. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're in Amber or Athena or any of these other ones, and you have an index and a show, and you have one class. Because I think Athena is still one class, even though there are annotations. Like you would have an index and a show.
I'd have to refresh my memory. I don't remember offhand.
I believe it. We'll go forward with that. I mean, even if Athena doesn't, many others do. So here's the problem. Let's say the index doesn't have any parameters. It's just like /users. Show is users/ID. Now you have no way within that class to know if you'll have an ID or not. Because if you're calling the index method, ID is going to be nil. But if you call show, ID is going to be present. That means that in show, you're going to have to call not nil.
It sounds like you really worked backwards from your goals. Like you had certain goals, and then you worked with the compiler and developed a series or a system from that. Did you get those from kind of your time at Thoughtbot and consulting, or did you get them from kind of developing? I mean, I'm just kind of curious how you came across those specific goals before actually designing the system. Is that something that you experienced before?
Yeah, I would say it mostly comes from being easily annoyed. So whenever I get annoyed by something that isn't helping me build a better product, then it's something I want to solve and never have to deal with again. If I'm annoyed because I'm just trying to do something super cool and it's just a complicated thing, that's a whole different thing. If I'm spending 3 hours because I'm trying to find all the spots where I missed a parameter, that's not valuable.
Totally
so
makes sense.
Every time that happened, I would kind of like log it in my mental memory as like, this is an annoying thing that I don't ever want to deal with. And how can I make it so that the computer deals with that instead of me?
And the biggest thing is like, okay. And the biggest thing for you in tracking that like mental map was keeping track of parameters, keeping track of paths and rendering and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's for the action layer. And there's more to it. So for example, I ran into a bug. We were building some kind of enterprise SSO software while I was at Thoughtbot. So this was a client. It had a lot of conditional logic, a lot of if, and then else if, else if, else if. We had 3 or 4 of those. Tests worked. TDD, yay for TDD. We pushed it up, boom, we get 500s. Why? Because I forgot an else block.
Bummer.
That's it. That's all it was. It was like we handled all the conditionals, and that's why TDD didn't work. And like the purists will say, well, technically you probably didn't have the right failing test, but the thing is, people are humans, right? Like you are the one writing the test. If you forget the test, then it's not tested. And so that was an annoyance I really didn't want to ever have again. So Lucky requires that you return a response. So
I've had also multiple renders, which is pretty interesting. In a Rails app, you can call render more than once, and it does some fun stuff.
Yeah. That's a bit of an issue still in Lucky. There's not a huge way. You can never double render, but you can render nothing, basically. Like there's a plain text method, right? So if you did plain text hello, plain text world, you're only going to output the last one. The first one is basically going to just return something that was never used. So you're not going to get an error, but you can have like, I guess, a logical error, but I think that's very rare that people are like, rendering things and then just letting them sit. But it does catch if you forget. So if you like have an if and you forget an else, it's going to tell you, hey, you need to give me a redirect or JSON or HTML or something.
So this is actually a story that I tell when trying to sell people on Lucky. But when I first started kind of branching out on Lucky, kind of going further than the demo apps and kind of building my own app, I was sitting there and I had changed a line of code and it was in a conditional on action. And I jumped back to the browser and I tried to reload and it was like not working the way I thought it would work. And I looked back at the Overmind kind of terminal and it was breaking. And I was changing things and saving them and changing things and saving them, kind of following a Ruby and Rails debugging strategy, and then just stopped and looked at the error output. And the compiler was telling me exactly what I had done. And it was the answer I was looking for. I didn't need to add debugging or puts methods or write a test or do other things. Like I had changed a conditional inside an action, and in one of the branches, something could become nil. And it was saying, you can't do this. And it was the exact answer that I needed, but it was a change in methodology to actually absorb the answer. The compiler was telling me exactly what was going wrong, and the thing that I had changed would work. Like if I had reloaded the page, what I was working on would work, but something else would fail. And Lucky was kind of protecting me from that, but it took a change in mindset to realize the compiler was working for me. It was on my side and it was telling me what I needed, and it wasn't in the browser and it wasn't in puts output. It was the compiler, like the actual error message. It was kind of a realization for me of the power of kind of the complete compile time type safety.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. Because I mean, that's a goal. And so it's always good to hear that, like, oh, hey, it's like working for other people and not just me. And we spent a lot of time. This is actually something I want to push for Crystal to make easier. But we spend a lot of time trying to make our own compile time errors. So in that case, probably what you were seeing, if this were just Crystal, it'd say like, hey, you're returning a HTML response or nil somewhere, somehow. We don't know, because Crystal doesn't know what a response is or what you should do about it. And so we have to kind of use macros in a way that I'm not sure that they were intended, but whatever, it works, to basically make a lot of our own errors. So in that case, it probably is something like every action must return a response using an HTML, JSON, or redirect method. Gives you an example of the typical problem and then how to solve it. That's kind of taken from Elm. Elm has really great compile time messages. We wanted to do that with Lucky, but even to even further, because Elm, it still doesn't know about your code or like what you're building, but Lucky can. We know that you're using an action. We know that it's a web framework. And so we know probably what you're trying to do, and so can give a pretty good answer. We don't have that everywhere, but we have a label in our issues called Improve Error Experience.
Your error experience is pretty good. I remember seeing the errors and having to Google or grab through the code base to figure out how you guys were doing it. Because I'm like, wait a second, that's a compile time error. How did you tell me that I need an operation here, or need a needs or something like that? And I thought it was pretty cool. I've not seen another project do that.
Yeah, I think part of that is because it's hard. Part of it is, and I don't mean hard like, oh, we're so great, we did a hard thing. I mean, it's not really supported by Crystal. Like there's not an easy way to say, hey, when this is given the wrong thing, here's what I want you to raise. That's what I would love to see. And I think would be a great use of annotations, to just say like, hey, if the return type is nil, give them this message instead of your normal one, or in addition to your normal one. That would be so fantastic. And I think it'd make it so that more Crystal libraries would do things like that. But I only have so much time in the day. So I just work on Lucky for now, for the most part.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so that kind of goes for compile time debugging, compile time guarantees. Now, I believe Crystal was the first place that I saw linked how to actually do runtime debugging, but in general, what is Lucky support for runtime debugging, and do you guys have any plans to add more kind of introspection or debugging features?
Well, we do actually. So, I mean, of course, the goal is fix stuff at compile time, but there's always logical errors that no compiler can check, or if it does, it's not worth it. It's such a pain in the butt. This is where this is the Haskell way, where you can probably check just about anything in the world, except that it takes you, 20 days to make a CRUD UI. So, is it worth it? There's definitely times when you run into runtime errors. So we have an error page. It's open sourced. It's called exception page that a couple other frameworks use and is largely borrowed from the Phoenix framework. So it does show, you can look through what code lines were triggered and see like some basic request info. But honestly, that's table stakes. Everybody has that. What we're working on now is something called Breeze. This is something that'll just come bundled with Lucky, and it will record all kinds of events and information about the request when you're in development mode. And when the request is finished, it's going to tell you where to go to see it. So, for example, you make a request to the user's show page. It's going to show a line that says debug at localhost 5000 /breeze / the request ID. You can click on that, and it's going to tell you just about everything about that request. It'll tell you which pipes ran. So pipes are like before actions in Rails, or in Phoenix, they're like pipes. They call them pipes as well. It'll tell you what queries ran, what your session was, what your flash was. I'd eventually liked it to also tell you what emails were sent and what records were updated or created. We're going to start with something a little smaller, but that's the plan there, is to basically make it so you can see everything you'd want to see about the request right there.
Okay, I think I've actually seen your kind of initial take on that project. It was really cool, but that still is a lot of, I guess that's post-running, definitely not compile time errors.
Sure.
So that does provide a lot of runtime information. Lucky has an interesting take on the exec idea. Do you want to kind of expand on how you guys came to that and also what it is?
Yeah, so you're talking about Lucky Exec, which is kind of our solution to a REPL that doesn't exist in Crystal.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so, I mean, just to make sure everyone listening's on the same page, if you came from Ruby or Phoenix or any of these, or JavaScript even, you can typically run some kind of console or REPL. So you can type something and it tells you what the result was, and you can kind of just go line by line. That basically, at least for now, is not possible in Crystal. Maybe one day it will be with a ton of work. But it's not possible because it needs to basically recompile every single time. It can't just have one program where you're slowly adding lines. People have kind of gotten around that with stuff like ICR, where it basically makes it look like one of those REPLs you're using in Ruby or JavaScript, but it's recompiling after every line. So it basically has a file where like you type something, hit enter, it adds to that file and then recompiles it. That's quite dangerous and can lead to a lot of unexpected results, because let's say, for example, you enter a line that's like, make a Stripe request. And then the next line, you could do whatever you want, like puts hello. It's going to rerun that Stripe request. And every line you put after that, it's going to rerun it over and over and over. And that's the same for running database queries, creating stuff, updating. So it's a little scary. So what we ended up doing was creating Lucky Exec, which is based on another library called Cry. You type Lucky Exec, it gives you a file that requires your app, and this file is just a text file that you can edit in Vim or Visual Studio Code. Right now, it's mostly It's just hard coded to Vim, but we do want to make it so you can use something else. And you just type whatever you want in there. The advantage here is that you know what's running. You see the file, you know it's there. I actually kind of like it more because I get all my editor tools, right? I get autocomplete, I get formatting, I get syntax checking before I do anything. And once I run it, by default, Lucky Exec, when you start it up again, it's going to load up what you had previously. So I don't know if you've ever had a console where you have a bunch of stuff, you close it, and then you're kind of starting from scratch.
I've definitely had that. I have to say that the way that Lucky Exec works seems very appealing for a lot of use cases, but I could also see how the REPL in the purest sense would be something that I would miss. And there's a lot of things in which I really want to open a console in Rails, do a few things in a row, and either change one thing or do them in a way that I can see that I'm doing something very specific. So an editor, a short code block, the kind of execing 5 lines, it seems very ideal in the way that Lucky approaches it. But some of the more exploratory, doing something here and then doing something there, where I'm just kind of, I don't know the answer, but I do want to kind of, I guess, start poking is the best way to describe it. I find that Lucky has a little bit to be desired in there. You can use the one-line exec thing, but it's nice to have a REPL for things like that.
I totally agree with you. One thing I try to be careful of in general, but especially with Lucky, is solving one problem and introducing another, or solving one problem better, but then making another problem harder to solve. This is one of those, for sure. Ideally, a REPL would be an option. I like Lucky Exec for a lot of stuff and do think it's better for a lot of the stuff that I'm writing. But yeah, you're exactly right. Like sometimes you're just like, what does this data look like? And you just want to explore it. And a REPL is the best way to do that. Yeah,
I think a REPL really is. One thing that Lucky's kind of pushed me into is that previously in other jobs and currently at the position I'm in now, we have a lot of scripts or what would just be kind of like command line tools to interact with our web server. And with Lucky, I find that instead of doing things kind of one-off or in that type of poking or updating sense, I end up making a lot more tools for myself. And I think that's a good thing. There's not really a CLI supported way of doing things that I'm aware of in Lucky. There are tasks, I believe, but not as much of like a Thor type interface. But I'm not sure if that will come, and it hasn't really been that big of a problem. So
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's another goal. I mean, there's a lot of goals, and I do. Luckily, me and the core team, I think, share a lot of those goals. So it's been very frictionless. We definitely want to encourage those types of things. So even with Lucky Exec, I've felt a REPL is still nice, but I've liked Lucky Exec more than I thought. Basically, what you have to do, the main bummer is you kind of have to hit PP for a pretty print.
Yep.
And that it sounds ridiculous, but you want a pretty print, and then it'll output everything you need. And the kind of cool part is it'll re-output and you can adjust stuff so you can like go back to the first line and be like, oh, that was actually wrong. Not always ideal, but it's kind of nice. And it's the same with tasks and scripts. So like, for example, we push using a setup script pretty hard. That comes out of the box. That's how you set up Lucky. We don't even really tell you how to set up Lucky. We just say, here's the dependencies and run your setup script. And that's kind of convention over configuration. We're saying like, this is a good way to build your project. Recently, we added a system check script that checks like your common dependencies, make sure things are running. That runs as part of script setup, but also every time you start Lucky Dev. And what that means is even people coming that are new to your team, they're going to get a system check as soon as they start. They don't even need to know anything about Lucky, and we'll make sure their system is up to date. And anytime someone on the team adds a check to that, you're going to get that check. So if it's like, oh, hey, we're using Elastic, let's add a check to make sure Elastic's running. Everyone on your team is going to get that check for free.
That makes
tasks, you're totally right about the CLI. I'm glad you mentioned that though, because Jeremy, one of the other core team members, actually has a PR up right now that makes it very easy to use Lucky tasks with arguments. So we've
Oh,
got
nice.
an argument macro, so you can define shortcuts, descriptions, whatever. You can add switches, and you can even add positional arguments, which are really helpful for just simple scripts where you really only have one argument. You don't need to give it a name. You just want to say, here's like the model or whatever. And that's now a lot easier to do. So that's hopefully going to be in the next release.
Awesome. Yeah, you guys are really punching out releases. They're coming fast and furious.
Yeah,
it's good to.
I got to keep busy.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my way of not thinking about things too much.
Now, are you able to work at this at your current position? Is your current position kind of interested in Lucky at all for something inside the organization?
So yeah, I mean, I work at GitHub now. I haven't even brought it up or tried. I try not to be too dogmatic about stuff. Truth is, Lucky and Crystal just aren't a good fit. I wouldn't suggest it as a good idea. And the reason for that is they have a Rails monolith, and it's huge.
That makes sense.
It's I don't even know how many hundreds of thousands of lines of code. If we were to start from scratch, I think Lucky could be great because of the speed, for one thing. You don't have to cache as much. The template rendering is insanely fast. Rails is not particularly good at that. But yeah, I'm not pushing for it too much. I could say, write a microservice or whatever, but the truth is I tend to dislike microservices. And if there's clear boundaries, if it's like, here's one thing, do it, and that service doesn't hit 5 other services to get information, that's great. But the truth is there's not like that many of those. And the ones that are there are already services at GitHub and are already written in like Go or something else that's fast. So people are interested. I've had a lot of people just say like, I think this is cool and have contributed or tried it out or whatever. But I don't see us actually using it at GitHub. Okay. I mean, it's just too big now. It's too risky.
That makes a lot of sense. Most organizations I've been in since, 2014 or something like that, we've been on the process of killing microservices. So it's pretty funny to see that kind of come through the zeitgeist. And I don't know, it's easy to have hindsight 2020. I don't know if I ever was like gung-ho about microservices, but I definitely have built a fair amount. So, it's interesting to see that as a trend come through. It is where I recommend people start with Crystal and any web framework, including Kamal or Lucky, just because of the support of third-party vendors. So Lucky has some support for things like Datadog and stuff like that, but the support is way less, and it just kind of cascades through the ecosystem, where there is generally support for anything you need to run a web application, but it might not be the specific vendor you're looking for. Like you can get a Sentry integration, but it's not like supported by Sentry.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's true. But we're getting there. Stuff's going fast. So
oh man,
I'm really excited.
I feel like it's accelerating. I feel like when I started with Crystal, it was super fun. But if you wanted to host something, I just feel like the level of support seems to be like doubling every year instead of just like increasing at a steady rate. It just seems like Crystal's come a long way in the past maybe 3 years, which is really cool to see.
Yeah, I agree. And it would be great to have 1.0.
You should listen to the podcast before this, which is not released yet. For those who are wondering and listening to this, Paul has not been able to listen to the first one, but there's some comments about 1.0.
Yeah, a lot of people were pushing it for a long time. I'm okay with it coming when it is coming, but it'll be nice. Because the truth is, once you hit 1.0 as a programming language, like you're locked in for a while.
Yep. Look at Ruby.
So
look at Ruby. It's stuck with 1.0 for a very long time.
Yeah, very long, and it makes sense. Like no medium size or big company is ever going to want to use something where the language has breaking changes every year.
Yeah. And also, it's really fascinating. I was describing this in the previous podcast, but the difference between a 0.9 and a 1.0 is one of the biggest jumps you can make as a language. And it is crazy. You can go from a 4.7 to a 5.0, and it's nowhere near as interesting. You can go from a 5.2 to a 7.2, and it's still cool and it's dangerous, but it's nowhere near as dangerous as a 0.9 to a 1.0. Those three little characters mean so much to the industry, and it's kind of funny. It's
especially for like the lower level you get, right? The less you can change. Like Bash. Shell scripts, like they're not changing. Like they're not changing how you write an if statement.
Yeah.
Because they can't. Like everyone relies on it. And so the higher up the stack, the easier it is to make changes. Like web frameworks are a little easier than a programming language. And if you have like a tiny little library that just slugifies URLs, that's also easy. It's like, okay, cool. Like if you want to change the method, like I'll just grep it. Find and replace and go. So yeah, it'll be exciting though. I think Crystal's in a pretty good spot, and our goal with Lucky is to release it in a similar time frame. Maybe not exactly at the same time, but have it ready pretty soon after.
That's awesome to hear. There is something that you mentioned quite early on that I did want to cover as well, which is performance. Yeah. I came to Crystal for performance. I have done talks and do some performance work in Ruby. I'm a big fan of performance. I find slow code to be a code smell, and I know that kind of rubs some people the wrong way, and it depends on your opinions about code smells. But I think a well-performant app is a clean app, or a good, a well-coded app with no code smells. And I think it's really cool that you've taken performance on as like a center point of Lucky. I think we've kind of covered how you kind of came to that decision, but what does Lucky do to kind of, have performance pervasive throughout the framework?
I mean, to be totally honest, most of it just comes from Crystal.
Okay.
I mean, so performance is a big deal, but it's not, I wouldn't say performance is a differentiator between Lucky and other Crystal frameworks. And I also don't think it really particularly matters, because they're all so freaking fast that unless you're doing something extremely performance sensitive, you could choose any of them and be fine with the performance. Because as soon as you make a single database query, a single simple 1 millisecond database query, you're like, it doesn't matter. They're all going to be as fast. There have been some things. I built the router kind of from scratch, and I haven't benchmarked everybody, but the router is extremely fast.
Okay.
Millions of routes in milliseconds. So like the Rails router isn't particularly fast, but it is very featureful. Ours is not, but I'm working on it. So that's very fast. Besides that, I benchmarked page generation. Like you said, we have a DSL for that. It is very fast once you're in release mode, and it's just as fast as ECR, which is the templating language, because it uses the same principle. ECR in the end is compiled down to an IO object, and then it just adds strings to it.
Got it.
And that's exactly what we do. So performance characteristics are the same, except ours compile a lot faster. This is something people, I think, don't realize. Like Amber, they did somebody did something where they built a huge project, and Amber was taking like a minute and 30 seconds. And I'm not trying to call it Amber. It's just an example.
I read that blog post.
Yeah. Wait, what? Did you say you wrote it?
Oh, no, I read it. I read that blog post where he made 10,000 objects was like 100,000 generations. And it seemed a little interesting. It seemed like it might stress one specific part of a Crystal application, but interesting process to get there. But yeah, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's totally fine. But what you realize, ECR takes a lot of compile time, because each template Crystal is reading at compile time, parsing it, and then generating Crystal methods to add strings to an IO. That just takes time.
Yeah.
When it's small, it's fine, but once you start adding 1,000 templates, it grows. And so that was actually, when I was testing, that was one of the biggest compile time challenges with some of the frameworks, was just compiling ECR templates. Whereas Lucky, it's just Crystal classes and methods. The only macro we have is generating the HTML methods. So that's a one-time cost. After that, they're all just Crystal methods. They're not macros.
Okay.
And so things go up fairly linearly. I mean, Crystal's strong suit is not compiling stuff fast by any means, but it's not going into like minutes just by adding like a couple hundred routes and pages.
That makes a lot of sense and is really good to hear. I'm really curious if unused templates are not in the compilation phase. Like if Crystal would know to not spend time on that. But I guess that's like an edge case of the compilation. It is cool to hear that you're leaning so much on Crystal for performance. There's a few other areas of performance, mostly involving caching. Do you guys have a caching integration and anything with like just default caching queries to the database or anything like that?
Not right now. That's definitely on the roadmap. And actually, I totally misspoke. There are some things we do for performance that I kind of just forgot. But we want to add a per fiber query cache. That'll help a lot. That's something in Rails and a lot of other frameworks. We just kind of haven't gotten to that. One performance, I don't want to say addition, a feature that was kind of built in from the start is making it really easy to spot N+1 issues with the database. So this is something I kind of got from Ecto, which is Elixir's FRM or whatever you want to call it.
That. We should call it that from now on.
Yeah, if you don't preload whatever records you need, you just can't access them. And that's partly because the object it has no methods. So let's say you have a user with comments. That user object, or basically like you could think of it as a hash, would have a comments key. And by default, it just has another object called association not loaded. Mm-hmm. So if you try and call comment or user.comments in your view, it's just going to blow up with a runtime error because it literally can't get those comments. I liked that because it stopped your N+1s. I didn't like that we got runtime errors from it because sometimes you wouldn't have an N+1 under certain conditions. You add a new conditional, you forget to test that, or you don't have time. I mean, let's face it, there are plenty of people who don't write 100% code coverage. You deploy to production and you get an association not loaded error. That is worse than an N+1 query, in my opinion. So the way Lucky does it is in development and test, it will raise a runtime error if you try to access an association that hasn't been loaded. In production, it just lets it through. It lets you lazy load.
Oh, no way. Oh, man.
Yeah. So
I didn't know that.
You're good in production, no errors, but in dev and test, because the idea there is like, sure, it's in production being a little slow, but you're not having 500 errors. One of these days, you're going to be like, why does this page load so slow? And you're going to pull it up in your dev environment, and you're going to be like, oh, that's why.
It's a good training
tool.
That's way better. It's a great training tool. I've actually run into those, and I've gone and fixed them. I didn't realize that they would work in production because sometimes, to be honest, it's been a little too like kind of tricky depending on what I'm doing to actually fix it, and so I've felt like I've spent too much time on it. But now knowing that, I think it's really good because it really forces me to fix them. But sometimes it is a little bit like I'm pushing a project that I'm trying to get off the ground, and sometimes I'm okay absorbing an N+1. That's a really good feature to know. I actually didn't know that that's the way that worked, but I have seen this.
Yeah,
I appreciate.
And there's lazy load. There's a lazy load option for all of them, which I'm not sure if you knew about that, but like if you were to do user.comments, that'll enforce that you preload. But if you do .comments with an exclamation mark, it will just, if it's not loaded, it'll lazy load it and not raise an error.
I did not know that. I'm going to have to go back and take a look at some of the things I'm working on now. But that's really good to know.
So sometimes it's not an N+1, right? Like if you were to say current user.comments, that's not an n+1. You're making one query. If you preload the comments, it's making one query. You're actually exactly the same. I tend to still preload anyway in case that code changes, and I am passing it like a list of users, in which case that would become an n+1. But sometimes it's not an n+1. There's no way for Lucky to know. And so you just lazy load it. Or in tests. That's another one where I rarely care. It's like, look, I have a user, just give me the comments. And so I'll use the bang method and just ignore the lazy load error.
Now, we are talking around a subject that I don't think we've actually covered previously in this podcast, which is that queries are actually broken out into their own object. Now, we briefly mentioned that the active record concept of a model is broken into 3 parts, but can you quickly cover why you chose to break things out into a query object?
Yeah, totally. Basically, it's like one of the other goals of Lucky was trying to add features by just relying on objects, plain old objects. So for example, in active record, you have scope. Like scope is a metaprogramming method that kind of just adds a bunch of other methods. And it also does a lot of hackery. Like if you look into how that works, it's weird because you can also do a class method. So say you had a scope called like with completed tasks, like user with completed tasks. You could also do that with def self for completed tasks, and it would work. And that's because they're using all kinds of like method missing responds to craziness. And that's the thing is that's work that Rails, like they had to build that in. And it's something you have to write tests for and blah, blah, blah. So the goal was to basically let you use scopes without doing anything, just being super lazy on my end, just letting you do it because we use a query object. So what you do to add a scope, which you're aware, but I'll share with everybody, is you add a method. If you want to with completed tasks, you just add a method called with completed tasks. How do you pass arguments to it? You just pass it an argument. So it's also less to learn. That's the biggest reason we went with it, was because it's just simple. You know how to extend it. You can include modules in it. You can add instance methods. You can use arguments. Or another thing, default scopes. Active record, you say like default scope, such and such. In Avram, we have Avram is the ORM for Lucky. That just isn't a thing. Instead, you just override the initializer and put whatever you want in there. That's how you get a default. I think that's part of how Lucky has been able to add so many features is by taking time looking at how can we just use built-in language features to do the things we want to do.
Yeah. I'm really curious. There's a new language feature that is still in RFC. It is the shorthand method or the one-liner method type syntax.
The endless method, is that?
That's the name of it. Yeah, the endless method. I'm curious if you guys could use that. It's always interesting when a new language feature comes out, but I'm curious if that could be a part of the kind of Lucky generators or syntax to kind of make some things easier. I can't think of a great place in Lucky for that right now, but I'm sure there's something.
Well, like a query object might be a good example. Let's say you want to get all users over the age of 18. We'll just call them, adults. You want to add an adult scope. You could do def adults, and then on the other side, it would be age.gt for greater than, or GTE greater than or equal to 18. And that would be a one-liner.
All right. I think we just came up with a use case for that. We should put that in the RFC.
Yeah. Well, we're actually using something similar, and I put this in the RFC. There's a macro in Lucky called quickdef.
Oh, no way.
For this, because we use classes for pages and HTML layouts, which, by the way, is another thing where we just circumvented tons of work. We don't have to deal with how do you make a layout, right? Like, that's actually fairly complicated because you're having to render to temporary IOs and inject it in other parts of the page and blah, blah, blah. We're just using a class.
Yeah.
Like your layout is a class that calls methods on a subclass. So for a page title, you have a page title method that you would define on your child page. So if you had a main layout and had a user show page, you could say def page title, this is my user. Quick def was basically invented just for that, so that you could say quick def page title and a string.
All right. That's pretty cool, actually.
So,
I can see that
yeah,
now.
there's definitely some spots. Yeah.
And just kind of wrapping up the kind of feature list, you also have something called batteries included in the framework. I'm guessing that means support for things like Webpacker. Is that correct?
Yeah, honestly, it's not as batteries included as I'd like, but yes. So built-in support with Webpack. It uses Laravel Mix, which is a layer on top of Webpack to make it not so painstaking to set up even the most basic thing.
And way more documented than Webpacker. Laravel Mix versus Webpacker documentation is night and day.
Oh, it's so much better. I'm so glad I found that, which is another lucky principle. Like if somebody else has already done it, like don't reinvent the wheel. Like that's why we use Overmind for the process manager. Like we're not, but yeah, so Webpack, it means you can get built-in authentication. And it's worth noting that all of these things in our initialization wizard will allow you to choose, do you want that? Because you might be making an API. We don't want to force that. But yeah, authentication. It means we have an email solution for sending emails, ORM, some security headers and defaults that you can include. Basically like production ready to build most of what you need. Or like, for example, this last release, we added pagination. So that's now built in. Pagination components that you can use out of the box or customize to look however you want. Slugify, Avram Slugify, so you can slugify different columns in your database for pretty URLs. Just kind of the core things. There's more we want to add. Like I would like to add some kind of authorization library, something Pundit-like, but type safe and kind of easy to use in Crystal. And probably some better generators. But I've got an idea I'm working on that's, I think, probably going to be huge.
Interesting. But do you want to keep it a secret? Or do you want to tell us?
No, we can talk about it a little bit. I mean, part of what I realized was I can't just sell performance and fewer bugs. Like you need to have that holy crap moment. The kind of the time to first delight is what I keep thinking about. That time where you go, oh my gosh, I just did that. And I haven't been able to do that in my whatever language of choice at all. And now I did it in 15 minutes. That's the kind of thing I want to get to. So we're slowly getting to where you can just prototype and be like, I can generate an app with authentication and this other cool stuff. So the other cool stuff is, right now the working name is Fusion. It takes ideas from Phoenix Live View, if you've seen that, Livewire and Laravel, or Rails has something called Stimulus Reflex.
I have seen that.
They're all kind of, they do things differently but solve a similar problem, and that is JavaScript is kind of getting out of hand. Having to write an API, whether that's REST or GraphQL, it takes time. There's complexity in having a front end and a separate back end. Like you can't just call your same model methods. You have to duplicate validations a lot of time. And so the solution here is do it on the server back end and push it over WebSockets. I think every one of them use WebSockets. So the idea would be, as you change a form, for example, you hit a form, rather than submit over regular HTTP and returning a page, it sends something to the server and then sends back like a piece of HTML. That's not totally technically true because Stimulus Reflex by default sends the whole page. And Live View actually does a lot of cool diffing on the server to only send parts of the HTML back, but that's the basic tip. So it solves a problem. There are problems with those approaches that make it not quite there for me. The main one is latency. So a lot of people are showing these different UIs and they're testing locally where there's 0 milliseconds latency basically.
Mm-hmm.
Or within the same country, which maybe you're hitting like 60 to 100 milliseconds of latency. That's not really that noticeable.
Or not on
But
mobile.
what if you're on a bad connection or someone's in Australia and my server's on the East Coast? We're talking 300 milliseconds of latency plus whatever time it takes to generate the response.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine for when you are going to the server because you need something from the server. So what I mean is if you are creating a comment and you have 300 milliseconds of latency, that's fine because you would have that no matter what. Like if you were using React or anything else, like you still have to call the server. It's going to take some time. But what about opening like a menu? You don't want that to be 300 milliseconds. Like you hit your profile button and you're just sitting there for 300 milliseconds.
Yeah, that'd be pretty. Clicking a hamburger menu on a card or something like that.
Yeah, there's all kinds of these situations that are just client side. And you want those to be instantaneous, or at least that's my goal. Like if it's not instantaneous, I'm not doing that. There's no way. I can't be proud of a site where, the drop-down menu takes 300 milliseconds because of latency. So the Laravel Livewire guy, he made a library called Alpine.
Okay.
It basically works a little bit like Vue, but you can change the HTML at any time. And it I don't even know how it works or how to describe it. Just check it out. It's called Alpine Js.
Okay.
But it lets you use a Vue-like syntax, but with regular HTML. You don't need to compile templates. You can change that HTML and the data will not get out of sync. And they're using that with Livewire. And in a way, I kind of want to use with Fusion to do both the server stuff. So the stuff you need to be with the server works. But then Alpine is used for like the client-side interactions. It solves both pieces of that puzzle. Fusion's going to do something similar, except also type safe, which none of the other ones have.
Really? That would be crazy. I think that is both a really great aspirational goal for Lucky, and if it was when it is deployed, it will be a very big draw to a framework like this.
I think so. It's one of those things like that other stuff's cool, but like I was mentioning and like you said, you don't get it until you use it.
I feel like what you're describing is a cross between something like Elm with like a compile time guarantee at the front end and some of the interactions, and the ease and kind of the syntax of the back end of something like Crystal. That's actually extremely compelling. I really like that idea. It seems like a boatload of work. I mean, just even having integrations. Oh, I don't know.
I put a proof of concept together without too much work. It's nowhere near being totally ready, but just to have a proof of concept was very cool. And there's a lot of libraries out there that make it easier. There's Morphdom, which basically lets you you might have a DOM element on your page. You can give it a new DOM element and it morphs it. It doesn't just replace it. It just changes classes and methods and or tags and stuff. And so you don't get jitters. It doesn't mess up autofocus or scroll. So we're using that. Alpine, that was like the missing piece, actually. I knew I wanted client side, but didn't know how to do it. They've basically solved that. I just need to hook into it.
I think this is a really good kind of cliffhanger to leave people on. I think that we've covered a really good amount of the scope of this project, the goals, the specific things that you've actually implemented, and the things that you carried over from other communities and other web frameworks. And then we have this kind of a announcement or a cliffhanger at the end. Do you want to kind of give a little summary of this Fusion in like a 1 or 2 sentence kind of pitch? Can you pull a DHH?
Yeah, I'll try. You can have interactive clients, rich client-side interactions that are type safe with no API and that are instantaneous for the ones that should be and are just as fast as any SPA for the ones where you need to hit the server. But it's type safe and it's easy.
Love it. That's a really, really good kind of pitch. we have gotten through about half the material that I wanted to cover with you, so we'll have to have you back on so that you can share more about Lucky, what you guys are doing, your path to 1.0, your future plans for both Crystal and Lucky, and possibly, what Crystal can do to help you support Lucky. But in general, do you have any asks or any requests for the community if they listen to this that you would like help on, either in Lucky or any of the projects you're working on?
Yeah, sure. I'd say the number one thing, just build Lucky or build stuff with Lucky. Try it out. People ask how they can help with code or adding features. The best way is to build something and go, I want that, and then build it into Lucky, because then you kind of have motivation, and I find that helps a lot. And if it works great for you, just give feedback, stop by. We're super friendly in the Gitter channel. Like, we try not to be intimidated. Like, you can ask anything, so just hop on by, try it out, let us know what you think. And also know that whatever's there today, we're working on things very quickly to make it even better.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on Chicago Crystal, and we'll have to have you back. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We are on the web at chicagocrystal.org. And also, if you look at our meetup page, or if you look at us on Twitter, we're at Chicago Crystal. Paul, would you like to shout out any of your social media handles or where people can find you online?
Yeah, sure. On Twitter, I'm Paul C. Smith. That's C for Charles. Follow me there. I post about a lot of Lucky stuff, sometimes some GitHub stuff, and all kinds of things. Head over to luckyframework.org to learn more about Lucky. And you can also subscribe to new blog posts, or just follow Lucky Framework on Twitter at Lucky Framework. And we make sure to post everything there. And honestly, we post a little more there because it's easier to just share some quick ideas. So that's a great place to go if you want to keep up to date.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Chicago Crystal, and we will see you soon. A big thank you to our producer, Christy Flores, who edits these podcasts, and our DJ, Bill Wesley, who provides the tracks and samples for these episodes. This was an episode of Chicago Crystal, building community and getting stuff made in our favorite language. We'll see you soon.